Have you ever loved someone so deeply that you handed them the keys to your past, your future, and everything in between, only to realize too late that they were mapping out their escape? My name is Ethan Rowe. I'm 52 years old, a structural engineer from Denver, Colorado. And until recently, I believed my life was built on something solid, like the foundations I design every day. But sometimes the cracks don't show until the structure starts to sink. I was in my home office when I received the email. My wife, Vanessa, was away on another spiritual retreat, this time in Tulum, Mexico. The message was brief, no greeting, no emotion. Just a statement. I've moved the inheritance into my personal account, it's better this way. Attached was a photo, her on a beach at sunset, beside a man I didn't recognize. They looked carefree, intimate. She held a glass of wine, and smiled in a way she hadn't in years. I closed the laptop. The money meant something to her, sure. But to me, it was never about numbers. It was about a promise I'd made to someone long before she ever came into my life. And what she didn't know is that I'd been preparing for this moment all along. The inheritance wasn't just a financial windfall. It was a legacy. It came from Garrett Rowe, my uncle, though he was more like a father to me. He was a Vietnam veteran, a man of few words, but unshakable principles. When my own parents died in a car accident, Garrett didn't hesitate. I was 10 years old, orphaned and angry at a world I didn't understand, and he took me in without a second thought. He didn't raise me with grand speeches or dramatic lessons. He taught me by doing, by showing up, by standing still when life demanded motion and moving only when it truly mattered. He had a saying, "Don't build what you can't stand to live in." It applied to everything, houses, friendships, even marriages. He never married himself, never trusted easily, but he built a life that stood tall in its own quiet way. When he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, I took time off from work to be with him. He never asked for it, but I owed him more than time could repay. We talked less than I wanted, but just enough to know that he had made peace with what was coming. A week before he passed, he handed me a small envelope. Inside was a note written in his unmistakable block letters. Build for others what I never had. I didn't know what that meant at the time. Only after the funeral, when his attorney Marla Sinclair sat me down, did I realize the weight behind those words. Garrett had left me everything. His savings, the house, a piece of land outside of Boulder, and most surprising of all, a trust fund he had quietly built over decades. The total value was just over $600,000. He'd never spoken of it, never hinted at it. It was just like him, quiet preparation beneath the surface. Vanessa's reaction was telling. She smiled, hugged me, said all the right things. But there was something rehearsed in her warmth, something too eager. "We could use this to do something meaningful," she said over dinner that night, swirling her wine. "Maybe expand my wellness brand, build a healing center, a retreat space. You could design it, I could run it." She spoke with enthusiasm, but none of it was about Garrett. None of it acknowledged who he was to me. I nodded. I didn't argue. I just watched. Because part of me knew, even then, that Garrett's final gift wasn't just money. It was a test. A structural stress test. Not of steel or concrete, but of trust. Of intention. Vanessa didn't know it yet, but that trust was protected. Not just legally, but emotionally. And while she was already thinking about what she could take, I was thinking about what I needed to protect. That was the beginning. Not of the end, but of the revelation. And in hindsight, it was when the ground beneath our marriage began to shift. At first, nothing changed. Or at least nothing that I could prove. Vanessa still kissed me goodbye in the mornings. Still hosted her client webinars from the sunroom. Still brought home organic groceries and lit sage in the living room before our Friday night dinners. But the tone of her presence began to shift. Her affection grew lighter, like a coat she only wore for guests. She started spending more time away, at first for weekend workshops, then for week-long retreats in places like Sedona, Big Sur, and eventually Tulum. Each trip was justified as soul work or client immersion. I didn't question her, not directly, I just listened. Her language changed too. She spoke less about our goals and more about her alignment. Money became an energetic tool, something that shouldn't be hoarded. One night, over dinner, she floated the idea of trust transformation, saying that sometimes wealth needs to be liberated from its old stories to flow properly. She smiled as she said it, as if it were profound. I nodded. I'd learned not to interrupt her when she was philosophizing. But behind my calm expression, I was filing things away. I noticed she kept her phone face down during meals. Her passwords changed. She began locking the cabinet in her home office, a cabinet that for years had housed nothing more than vision boards and extra incense. And when I asked casually if she needed help managing our household bills, something I'd always done, she waved me off with a laugh. You've done enough, she said. It's my turn to handle the logistics. It wasn't the words that concerned me. It was the way she said them, like a woman slowly folding a map she no longer wanted to share. 3 months after Garrett's trust was finalized, Vanessa started asking subtle questions. At first it was framed as curiosity. How do trusts work again? Then it became more pointed. Where's the account located? Is it under your name only, or is there a joint access option? Wouldn't it be more practical to consolidate everything into one place? Each time I gave vague answers. I'll check with Marla, I'd say. It's probably in the paperwork. She didn't press, but she noticed my lack of detail, and so she adjusted tactics. Vanessa became warmer, more affectionate. She cooked dinner more often, scheduled reconnection weekends for us. First I wanted to believe it was genuine, but I couldn't ignore the pattern. These bursts of warmth always came after one of her inquiries about the trust. Her kindness felt like currency, invested for future withdrawal. One afternoon I walked into her office while she was out getting groceries. The cabinet she'd started locking had been left slightly ajar. Inside, I found something she hadn't meant for me to see. Not money or legal documents, something far worse. A spiral notebook filled with scribbled notes, arrows, and underlined words like access, emotional leverage, and authentic vulnerability. My name appeared twice in a list titled Case Study Subjects. It wasn't just about me. There were others. I snapped a photo of the page and quietly closed the cabinet. That night I said nothing. I listened as she told me about her day, about how a client had wept during a chakra realignment session. I smiled, nodded, even kissed her goodnight. But something had cracked open inside me. Not anger, not fear. Something colder, precise. Week later, Eduardo arrived. She introduced him as a visiting facilitator, there to help restructure her client onboarding process. He was tall, serene, with an unsettling stillness. The kind of man who never blinked long enough for you to read him. I shook his hand and studied him, the way he lingered in doorways, the way Vanessa's voice softened when she addressed him. She said he'd be staying in the guest room for 2 nights. He stayed 5. I didn't confront her. I installed motion detectors in my office instead. Synced the security system to alert me when someone accessed the home Wi-Fi. I wasn't paranoid. I was preparing. Garrett once told me that buildings never collapse without warning. The trick is to listen before they fall. Now, I was listening, very carefully. The night Eduardo left, I sat alone in the kitchen long after Vanessa had gone to bed. I didn't touch the wine she'd poured for me or the turmeric elixir she claimed would open my heart chakra. I didn't need clarity. I needed precision. The pieces were all there. Her questions about the trust. The notebook filled with strategy, not spirituality. Eduardo's lingering presence and the way he moved through our home like he already owned part of it. I no longer wondered if Vanessa was planning something. I knew. And the time for observation had ended. I contacted Marla Sinclair the next morning. Garrett's longtime attorney had a mind like a vault and the instincts of a chess player. I explained everything, methodically, without accusation. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a pause. "You were right not to engage," she said. "Garrett's trust was placed under an irrevocable structure. She can't touch the core funds unless you authorize it. But if she tries to access it, if she so much as submits incorrect credentials, we'll catch her in the act." "Good," I replied, "because I want to give her the illusion that she already has access." We created a plan. I worked with Marla to establish decoy accounts, shell setups linked to legitimate-looking documents, populated with just enough activity to seem real. At the same time, I hired a cybersecurity analyst, a quiet freelancer named Aiden who specialized in tracking internal breaches. He'd worked on high-stakes corporate leaks and had once helped expose an embezzlement scheme at a nonprofit. Now, his job was to monitor logins, map IP addresses, and flag any attempts to access financial data from outside our home. I moved carefully. I created a folder on our shared drive titled Trust and Financial Merge and populated it with mock spreadsheets, investment statements, and transfer guidelines. I saved it under Retreat Center Planning. Vanessa found it within a week. I know because the first access alert came in on a Wednesday night just after midnight. The IP address traced to a yoga compound in Tulum. She opened the folder 3 times in 2 hours, downloaded the spreadsheets, viewed the notes, copied a file titled Legacy Funds Transfer Protocol. She even left behind a trail of renamed PDFs on her own cloud backup, a folder titled Post-Integration Strategy. She had no idea she was inside a decoy, and I had everything I needed. Still, I didn't act. I waited. I let the illusion grow. I played the role she needed me to play, detached, distracted, maybe a little lost. I gave her just enough to believe I was disengaged. The next morning, when she texted from the airport, her tone was unusually light. "Thinking of staying. Longer this time," she wrote. "This place is powerful." I replied with a simple, "Do what feels right." She believed I'd given up, that I was too passive or too trusting to see what was happening. But trust, I'd learned from Garrett, isn't about blind faith. It's about structure, protection, engineering against collapse. The following week, I pretended to stumble across one of her live streams. It was a group Zoom session titled Financial Freedom Through Energetic Realignment. I watched in silence as she coached a room full of eager faces. "We often inherit stories of scarcity from our families," she said with theatrical ease. "Even inherited wealth can be a block. It's our duty to transform that energy, to move it where it can heal." She was talking about me, about Garrett's trust, about her plan. At one point, she referenced a client who had just begun opening his wealth portals by releasing control over inherited resources. The chat applauded. She smiled gently into the camera, the same smile she used to give me when I still believed in her. I saved the video, another piece for the file. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for, an alert from Aiden. Multiple failed login attempts to the actual trust interface. Each attempt used my personal details, the date of my college graduation, my mother's maiden name, the name of the street Garrett grew up on. None of the answers worked, but someone had known the questions. Aiden traced the login attempts to an IP address in Tulum, specifically the same resort Vanessa had tagged in a recent Instagram post. The timestamps matched the hours she'd claimed to be leading sunrise meditations. The next morning, I called Marla. "It's time," I said. She didn't ask what I meant. She already knew. Vanessa had made her move. Now it was my turn. The more I pulled back the curtain, the more disturbing the reality became. Vanessa hadn't just tried to access the trust. She had been preparing for it long before Tulum. Her manipulation hadn't been spontaneous, it had been strategic, meticulous, layered beneath the language of healing and emotional growth. She had weaponized intimacy, turned therapy into reconnaissance. And what I uncovered next made it clear. I wasn't the only one. Late one night, I logged into our shared drive again, this time exploring the folder titled Client Resources. Most of the files were generic PDFs, guided meditations, breathwork outlines, branding materials. But buried deeper, inside a subfolder labeled Legacy Pathways, I found something she'd overlooked. Documents, names, spreadsheets. A private intake form used for onboarding new clients. Only this version was different from the one she'd shown me before. This one asked about family history, inheritance expectations, access to financial accounts, insurance payouts, and retirement, holdings, questions disguised as wellness prompts. One section was titled Energetic Constraints Around Wealth, with an open-ended field. What would you do with your money if you could release control? And beside each name, dozens of them, was a rating. Target viability. High, emotional. Compliance developing. Partner resistance minimal. It was an investor prospectus cloaked in spiritual language. And I was client number 4. There were notes under my name, details I hadn't shared with anyone except during private couples therapy sessions. Trauma timelines, grief patterns after Garrett's death. Sentences I vaguely remembered saying in moments of vulnerability, now repurposed as leverage points. That's when I knew. Vanessa had downloaded our therapy transcripts. Our counselor, Dr. Leary, had kept all our session summaries in a secure folder we could access through a private portal. We'd agreed on that for transparency, and I'd assumed it was protected. But I'd never changed the shared password, and apparently neither had he. Vanessa had taken everything we'd worked through and reframed it, not to heal us, but to learn how to break me efficiently. My hands shook as I scrolled, not out of rage, but out of a deep bone-level understanding. This woman, this person I had built a life with, had seen me not as a partner but as a case study, a source, an asset, someone to be harvested then released. I forwarded the entire folder to Marla, then backed up the data in 2 places. I sent a separate message to Aiden with the files for metadata analysis, timestamps, device fingerprints, anything that could trace the movement of those documents. He called me 2 hours later with his report. Half of these files were accessed from the retreat center in Tulum, same device as the trust attempt. She's been using your cloud drive as a playbook for months, and there was more. She uploaded a private PDF, seems to be a financial outline, titled Post-Ethan Phase. I opened it. Line items, projections, monthly estimated costs, including rent in Santa Fe, ad spend for her brand, and private coaching fees for someone named Eduardo. There was even a margin line labeled Trust Access Funds, minus 15% anticipated resistance. She'd already started planning how to spend what she thought she'd take from me. I closed the laptop, stood in the middle of our living room, the one we'd decorated together with purposefully mismatched furniture and framed travel photos, and saw it all for what it truly was, a beautifully constructed lie. The plants, the books on spiritual intimacy, the laughter around charcuterie boards and meditation playlists, it was all set design. And I had been playing my part without realizing the story wasn't mine. But I wasn't broken. Not anymore. Instead of reacting, I planned. I reached out to Lena, my goddaughter, Garrett's former mentee. She had grown up around our family, and Garrett had sponsored her through architecture school. Now she worked in community development and trauma-informed design. I told her I needed her expertise and her instincts. She came by the next day and we walked through the house together. I explained everything in pieces, carefully, without resentment. She listened, nodding slowly. She's not just a manipulator, Lena said. She's a predator. And she's running a system that uses healing as camouflage. But you've got receipts. That means you can do more than walk away. You can dismantle it. That night, while Vanessa live-streamed a full moon abundance session from Mexico, I sat at my desk drafting a list, not of what she'd taken, but of what I still had, and what I would do with it, because now I wasn't protecting myself from Vanessa. I was preparing to expose her. By the time Vanessa's abundance retreat was entering its 3rd week, everything was in motion. I had moved in silence long enough. Now it was time for action. The first step was formal. Marla and I met with a digital forensics specialist to certify every file, timestamp, and IP address related to Vanessa's unauthorized access attempts. This wasn't just about proving bad behavior. It was about establishing legal intent. The trust Garrett had set up was bulletproof, but attempting to breach it still constituted financial fraud. With the compiled evidence, Marla filed an official protective claim with the fiduciary board managing Garrett's estate, flagging the potential violation. Next came the divorce filing. I worked with Thomas Rayner, a lawyer Marla recommended who specialized in high-stakes financial misconduct cases. Tall, composed, and unflinchingly strategic, Thomas reviewed everything I gave him: the doctored spreadsheets, the downloaded therapy transcripts, the emails, even the spreadsheet Vanessa had titled Post-Ethan Phase. He looked up from the file and said, without blinking, "We won't just protect what's yours. We'll establish the fraud so clearly that no court will question who the victim is here." We filed under financial misconduct, breach of marital trust, and unauthorized attempts to access protected funds. In Colorado, while no-fault divorces are common, evidence of financial deception still weighs heavily in asset division. And we weren't just dealing with betrayal, we were dealing with intent to exploit. The next domino fell faster than I expected. A few days after Thomas served the papers, I received a call from Darren Pike, Vanessa's attorney. His voice was clipped, professional, and more cautious than I anticipated. "Mr. Rowe, I'm reaching out regarding the recent filings. My client claims she was unaware of any breach and disputes the characterization of her actions." I let him finish, then said calmly, "Have you reviewed the metadata on the documents your client downloaded from our shared drive? Or the failed login attempts from her retreat IP address? Because I'd prefer not to pursue criminal charges unless I have to." There was a pause. "Understood. May I request a meeting to discuss resolution options?" "You may," I said, "but come prepared." What Vanessa didn't know, at least not yet, was that we'd also begun coordinating with several of her former clients. After Lena and I reviewed the Legacy Pathways spreadsheet, we flagged 3 names that stood out: retired men in their 60s who'd attended multiple retreats, each with financial holdings listed in Vanessa's notes. I reached out carefully and respectfully. 2 never responded, but 1 did. His name was Joseph Becker, a retired teacher from Oregon. He told me that Vanessa had offered personal energy work after he'd revealed he'd inherited a pension lump sum from his brother. She encouraged him to clear money blocks by transferring funds to a private spiritual escrow, one managed, he later learned, by Eduardo. Joseph was shaken when I explained that I was going through something similar. "I thought it was just me being naive," he said. "But now I think she was grooming me. She said I was chosen." His story became a sworn affidavit. Thomas and Marla included it in our legal packet. Meanwhile, Vanessa's public image began to shift. Quietly, deliberately, I leaked segments of her group Zoom calls, only excerpts, carefully edited for clarity, not revenge. Clips where she spoke about transferring ancestral burdens into clean ledgers and helping clients detach from old money trauma by opening new energy accounts. I didn't post them. I sent them to a blog Lena recommended, a platform focused on exposing spiritual exploitation and abuse. They published an anonymous expose titled "The Healer Who Harvested Grief." Within 48 hours, Vanessa's PayPal merchant account was frozen for suspicious activity. Stripe flagged her digital products. She went silent on social media, and then she came home. She arrived unannounced, sun-kissed, dressed in flowing white, like a returning goddess. I was sitting in the living room with Lena, who didn't flinch when Vanessa entered. Vanessa blinked in surprise. "Didn't expect company." I stood up, gestured toward the documents on the coffee table. "Your lawyer will explain everything. We've filed." "For what?" she said, a brittle laugh in her voice. "You're overreacting. I haven't touched your precious trust." "You tried," I said. "We have the logs, the downloads, the access attempts, and the financial roadmap you so carefully titled Post-Ethan Phase." Her face changed. Just slightly. A shift behind the eyes. This is absurd. No, I said quietly. This is justice. Vanessa turned to Lena. And who are you? His therapist? Lena smiled. No, I'm someone who builds real things, not illusions. Vanessa stared at both of us for a long moment, then walked out without another word. But I knew she had finally understood. Her game was over. The aftermath didn't erupt like a scandal. It unfolded more like a quiet, methodical collapse. Exactly. The kind of precision Garrett would have respected. Vanessa had built her brand on serenity, on curated stillness and sage-scented clarity. But beneath the surface, the world she'd crafted was already beginning to fracture. 2 days after her abrupt return, her payment platforms, PayPal, Stripe, and Venmo, froze her business accounts pending investigation. Lena had submitted the anonymous report, backed by metadata and Joseph Becker's sworn statement. And though we hadn't named her publicly, her community of clients began to murmur. One of them, a former retreat guest from Sedona, published a personal essay, How My Spiritual Mentor Manipulated My Grief. It was raw, unsparing, and powerful. The blog post made its way onto several wellness forums. The ripple had begun. Meanwhile, Thomas had submitted all legal documentation to the county court. We were requesting a motion to freeze joint marital assets and formally bar Vanessa from approaching any of the financial accounts she'd tried to breach. He'd also included a separate petition requesting that the court take notice of her grooming behavior, an unusual but not unprecedented legal maneuver in cases of financial coercion masked as wellness practices. The judge responded swiftly. A temporary protective order was granted, effectively cutting Vanessa off from accessing any funds tied to either the trust or our joint accounts. We'd caught her just in time. Thomas, always careful with his words, looked up from the papers and said, She may have underestimated how seriously courts are starting to take spiritual exploitation, especially when the victims are vulnerable. Vanessa's lawyer, Darren Pike, scheduled an emergency meeting. He arrived late, looking less confident than before. Gone was the clipped tone, the corporate polish. In its place was something closer to quiet dread. My client is reconsidering her position, he began. She's open to settlement options. Thomas remained calm. She had her chance, she chose deception, now she gets consequence. Darren tried to argue that Vanessa hadn't actually moved any funds, that everything remained technically intact. But Marla responded with a calm, devastating line. She didn't need to succeed. The attempt was the crime. We gave Darren an ultimatum. Return what she had already pulled from our joint account, walk away from any claim to Garrett's trust, and sign a non-disclosure agreement barring her from ever discussing our marriage, divorce, or any client whose information she accessed through shared files. Otherwise, we would move forward with formal fraud charges, IRS referral, and a coordinated campaign to have her certifications, faux as they were, publicly reviewed. The next day, her online retreat portal went offline. Her social media accounts switched to private. By the end of the week, a notice appeared on her website. All services temporarily suspended due to restructuring. But the real turning point wasn't legal. It was personal. That Saturday, I received a letter. Handwritten. No return address. Inside was a check for $38,500, the exact amount she'd withdrawn from our joint account over the course of the previous 4 months. There was a note in her tight, elegant handwriting. For Garrett, for the part of you I couldn't own. I didn't respond. Not because I didn't have something to say, but because silence at that point said it all. The final hearing was brief. Vanessa appeared with a new lawyer, Philip Barnes, known for aggressive representation. He tried to contest the financial misconduct claim, citing emotional misunderstanding and miscommunication between parties. But Thomas handed over the metadata logs, client affidavits, and screenshots from Vanessa's Legacy Pathways folder. One by one, the illusions collapsed. The judge didn't take long. Vanessa would return the full amount she withdrew. She would forfeit any claims to the trust or joint property. The marriage was dissolved under grounds of deceptive intent, and the court formally acknowledged evidence of financial coercion, citing it as disturbing and deliberate. Afterward, Thomas turned to me and said, "She'll probably leave the state. Her brand's done here." But that didn't matter to me. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was clearing the ground to build something better. Back home, I poured the last of Garrett's favorite scotch into a glass and stepped out onto the back porch, the one I'd renovated with my own hands years ago. The stones beneath my feet, the beams overhead, the path Garrett had once helped me lay, it was still there, untouched. Vanessa had tried to erase a legacy, but all she'd done was reveal who had really built it, and now I was finally free to decide what came next. In the months that followed, I didn't rush to fill the silence Vanessa left behind. I lived inside it for a while, let it settle like dust over the spaces she used to occupy. The house was quieter, and I found myself moving through it differently, no longer as a man trying to maintain something for someone else, but as a man reclaiming what was always his. I sold most of the furniture she'd picked out, low-slung boho chairs, overpriced throw rugs that shed more than they softened, lamps that served more aesthetic than purpose. I kept the wood workbench Garrett had given me, the worn leather chair by the window, and the framed sketch of our first build site together. These were pieces that held memory, not manipulation. But I didn't stop there. I had work to do, not just for me, but for the promise I'd made Garrett. A promise I'd nearly forgotten under the weight of someone else's vision. Lena and I began drafting plans for what would become the Rowe Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting veterans in transition. The idea was simple: use a portion of Garrett's trust to fund architectural apprenticeships and community housing renovations for vets struggling to re-enter civilian life. Garrett had once told me that building something with your own hands was the fastest way to remember who you were. Now, I wanted to give that same clarity to others who'd been broken down by systems, trauma, or grief. We chose a plot of land outside Boulder, one Garrett had bought but never developed. It would house a retreat and learning center designed by veterans for veterans. Not a sterile institution, but a space of dignity. Clean lines, honest materials, natural light. A place where pain could coexist with progress. As the project came to life, so did I. Each decision, down to the type of gravel used in the meditation garden, felt like a piece of myself being put back together. I met with contractors, reviewed blueprints, approved materials, but I also met the men and women the foundation would serve, people with eyes like Garrett's, quiet, tired, but not done. One of them, a former Navy corpsman named Miguel, stopped me after a site tour. "You actually built this?" he asked. I nodded. "Not alone, but yes." He looked around. "It doesn't feel like charity." "It's not," I said. "It's legacy." Garrett's trust, once a symbol of betrayal, had become the cornerstone of something far more powerful, not just a project, a purpose. Vanessa had tried to twist that purpose for her own gain, but in doing so, she'd reminded me exactly why it mattered. 6 months after our final court date, Lena handed me a letter with a check inside, $10,000. It was from Vanessa. No return address. Just a note that read, "For Garrett's dream." It should have started with him. "I'm sorry it didn't." I didn't reply. I deposited it straight into the foundation's scholarship fund. Let it become part of something she could never take back. That year, we awarded our first architectural scholarship to a 19-year-old Marine Corps veteran named Theo. His application essay wasn't polished, but one line stood out. "I want to build spaces that remind people they're not forgotten." Garrett would have liked that. He would have nodded, said nothing, and gotten back to work. And as I stood outside the nearly finished retreat center, watching the team install the final beam on the front awning, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not just peace, but pride. Because betrayal didn't get the last word. Rebuilding did. People often mistake revenge for justice. But true justice isn't about destroying what hurt you. It's about building something stronger in its place. Ethan Rowe's story is not only about betrayal, it's about clarity, structure, and transformation. His silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. His calm wasn't surrender. It was strength. In a world where emotional manipulation can wear the mask of love and spiritual language is sometimes used to exploit trust, Ethan didn't just survive, he rebuilt.